Hello everyone, welcome to another session of the ACE Computer Vision Spotlight Series. My name is Mahdi Biparva. I'm a R&D engineer at Sunnybrook Research Institute and also a computer vision stream owner here at ACE. This is my pleasure to host another great talk today titled Some Salient Issues with Saliency Model. I'm excited to host our great presenter, Mr. Calden Wloka, in this amazing session. Calden is currently a postdoctoral visitor at York University working on visual attention modeling. He received his master's in 2012 and PhD in 2019 in computer science from York University under the supervision of John Sotzos. His doctoral research dissertation, An Evaluation of Saliency and Its Limits, received the John Baryon Doctoral Dissertation Award from the Canadian Image Processing and Pattern Recognition Society. Without further ado, let me welcome Calden to our session. Calden, please take it away.
All right, thanks very much. My name is Calden Wloka, and today I'll be talking to you about some salient issues with saliency models. I'm going to be presenting work that's largely drawn from two different papers. And so between those two papers, these are my co-authors. Yulia and I have done a lot of this work together under the supervision of John Sotzos. And then on the BMVC paper that we published last year, Amir Razuli also helped us to build the data set. But we'll get into the details in a little bit. So first off, it's important just to define what is saliency. So saliency is the stimulus-driven attentional pull of a visual element. So in this case, if you have, for example, a grid of shapes here, the large shape stands out from the smaller shapes and draws the eye. So that shape would be salient. However, it's relative to its surrounding content. So in this case, the same shape that was salient in the previous picture is no longer as salient as now the red shape, which is contrasted in color. So now the red shape draws the eye instead of the black ones. And it also translates to higher order images, like natural images, where you can have something that still stands out due to some sort of high-level contrast with its surroundings. So in this case, you have a red flower amongst a bunch of yellow flowers, and that red flower really jumps out at a viewer. So why study saliency? At its most general, saliency is the rapid assessment of conspicuity. So it's what information matters the most. It enables you to prioritize under processing constraints. This can include a lot of things like if you have limited onboard processing. If you have a mobile robot, security camera, or something like that limits your field of view. If also for intelligent cropping, so you see that a lot on platforms like Twitter, where they have a preview of an image and they want to try and guess what part of that image matters the most. So then they crop that image down to that preview. Usually it's based off of face detection, but saliency can also help for things that maybe don't contain humans. Also, as I mentioned before, processing or bandwidth limitations, like if you have a drone that's trying to have onboard processing, it tends to be very limited. Or if you've got anisotropic compression of a video stream. So if you're, for example, transmitting a video on Netflix, maybe you want to compress the parts of a frame that people are unlikely to be looking at. You can compress them more heavily, introduce more artifacts. But if people aren't actually attending to that location, it won't matter as much. So you can have a reduced stream that feels like it's still a high fidelity stream. Now this is important also for understanding human vision. So humans exhibit saliency effects. So if we want to understand how humans perform vision, then it's useful for us to research this. So we can better understand eye movements and fixation and predict where people are going to look. It also has applications in things like advertising and user interface design. If you want your user interface to be intuitive, then hopefully the areas of it that that you want a person to be able to interact with most often, that will hopefully be more salient and less hidden from them. So a quick note about saliency. It's, as I mentioned before, it's a very broad concept and has a number of subfields, including things like object or class saliency maps. So these were introduced by Simonian et al., where they performed a backpropagation sweep through a network to find out what pixels mattered most for an object classification. That's related in the sense of what is most important, but it's actually not a rapid assessment of what pixels matter. It's a post-processing assessment of which pixels went into your decision of the object. So I'm not going to be focusing on that. I just wanted to mention it. Likewise, salient object detection is essentially trying to do object detection, except that you don't really care about the category. You're just trying to find where is the object. So it's more like a proto-object selection area. But again, I'm going to be focusing on human saliency modeling for the purposes of this talk. So let's take a brief overview of how we got to where we are today in terms of saliency modeling. So the conceptual work of Koch and Ullman from 1985 is what really got things started. They proposed the idea of this attentional map. And then in 1998, Itti et al. Released one of the first widely shared implementations of a saliency model shown here. So if you have this picture of this adorable child and then you run it through a saliency model, the brighter pixels are the pixels that the model has picked up saying, hey, someone's probably going to look here. Now, in this case, you can see that this early model is very heavily influenced by things like color, so that it really likes the bright colors of the child's toy and doesn't pick up on the child's face, even though that's actually what draws the human eye. So it doesn't do a particularly good job for this image. However, if we fast forward 20 years, the number of models that is now available has dramatically increased. And this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but one of the things you can also see is each one predicts a very different allocation of saliency across the image. So with all of these different models being available, people needed a way to compare them and decide, well, which one is doing a better job of predicting saliency? But that's a fairly hard question to ask because it's not always clear what is drawing a person's attention. So with this need for comparison, Bruce and Sotos introduced a fixation data set in 2006 as a proxy for human attention. And so then once that kind of came out and they established the methodology for that, fixation prediction rapidly became the dominant method of comparing models and also the dominant goal of the models that people were producing. They were no longer necessarily attempting to model saliency in and of itself, but rather were attempting to maximize performance on these fixation data sets. So the reason why I mention this is because this is actually somewhat of an issue. Fixation location does not always coincide with the locus of attention or with what is most salient, because there are a number of confounding factors that go into this. So there's saccadic noise. When you move your eyes, you don't always move your eyes exactly where they're trying to go. Sometimes there's just motor noise in the system, and you might slightly miss where you're trying to look. You also usually only look as closely as you need. So there's what are called center of gravity fixations, and those are shown here. So this is actually a trace of a monkey looking, but humans behave very similar to this. And you can see some of the fixations are landing off of the bars in the search array. And what they're actually doing when they land sort of in the middle of nowhere is they're assessing multiple bars in the area. And likewise, you can fixate, if you give someone a blurred image, they'll actually fixate more accurately on objects in the image than they would if the image is not blurred. And the reason for that is because when there's blurring, people need to foveate more closely in order to actually be able to extract the detail of the image. So we have this kind of inverse relationship with noise and image quality, where we look more accurately when image quality goes down. And so fixation can also be driven by other factors such as internal motivation, world knowledge, or causal understanding. So I'm just going to play a quick video here and just try to pay attention to where your eyes are going when you're watching it. Unable to play video, that's an issue. All right. Not sure what to do with that, but I'll quickly describe what you were supposed to see. So you're supposed to see a sports segment. So essentially a soccer game with someone scoring a goal. And in that video, you would see your eyes tend to follow the ball. Even though there are a lot of humans running around, there's also humans in unique colors, such as a referee who wears something that's different from every player on the field. And so from a classic saliency model perspective, or even a machine learning based one, they're likely to focus on the humans because that humans will generally look at other humans in images. But for something like a game where you know that where the ball is, that matters more to understanding what's going on than anything else. You will often, and especially if someone really understands the game, they're going to anticipate where the action is. And so their eye movements will operate very differently than what a pure saliency assessment would indicate. So does this actually matter? If saliency and fixation aren't perfectly aligned, can we not just build a fixation predictor model? And so I would argue that that's not a great goal, or it shouldn't be our only goal, because saliency is a demonstrable psychological phenomenon in controlled settings. You can have an experimental setup where I show you different stimuli, and I can make very strong predictions about which ones you'll respond to faster or which ones you'll be able to find an object faster in based off of the relative salience of that object with the other items in the scene. And relying purely on learning from fixation data mixes all of these factors together. And that possibly neglects saliency, so that when you have highly salient images, which are very obvious to observers. So if I show you an image with, like, for example, that red flower amongst yellow flowers, that's a very salient item in that scene. And you would hope that a model that tells you where people are going to look would highlight that red flower. But if your deep learning model has largely determined fixation factors that are not based off of saliency, but are instead based off of image understanding or narrative understanding or any of those other factors, it might not highlight the red flower, in which case, if you're showing this to, for example, an advertising firm that's hoping to use your work, they might say, well, that's obviously wrong, so why should I trust your model for anything else? And so quickly, I'm just going to show some of these natural scenes with highly salient objects. Now, pay attention to the images are going to go through relatively quickly. Just try to keep in mind which thing in each image you noticed first. So usually people are going to notice the unusual item the most, and that's going to be the first thing that they notice in those images. So my co-author Yulia and I had been discussing this for some time, and eventually we basically just decided to build our own data set of these types of images. So we went through a few different sources, Reddit. There were a few subreddits that had people posting different types of images that kind of followed this model. And we came up with a new data set. And then we also combined that with a psychophysical object data set. So you can download all of that at the link posted there. So we have psychophysical patterns. They're the P3 data set. And then we also have the odd one out, which are the images I just showed you, called the O3. And we then benchmarked 20 saliency models on these data sets. So we used 12 classical models that aren't based off of deep learning, and then 8 deep learning models that had come out more recently. And we found that there wasn't a single model across all of these models we tested that adequately detected salient targets in all conditions. So I'll go through this in a little more detail now. So for example, our psychophysical examples, we had singletons that were based off of color, orientation, or size, and then the degree of variation we could play around with in order to adjust how salient those singletons should be. And then for the O3 images, we had items that varied based off of color, based off of size, based off of color and texture, and shape, size, and orientation. And there could be combinations thereof, but largely it was color, size, texture, shape, and orientation that contributed to our determination of singleton. Color was by far the most common one, and also the one that saliency models tended to handle the best. Size was very, very difficult. Virtually none of the models were able to handle size at all. So I'll get a little bit into the evaluation now. So if we want to get closer to psychophysical performance measures, we didn't base our evaluations off of fixations. We instead used relative saliency ratios, which have previously been shown to correlate with response time in humans. So we used a global saliency index, which is the target distractor difference divided by the target distractor sum. So it's a bounded metric. We also then just took the maximum saliency ratio of target versus distractor. So this is unbounded. So we averaged, we went over all of the targets and all of the distractors in the image, and we selected the maximum saliency value that was contained within their masks. And then we also took the same thing, but we took the ratio of the background salience, the maximum salience in the background versus the target. And the reason we did that is because it's not just item versus distractor, it's also the background factors in as well. And we wanted to make sure that the target items were standing out against the background. Sorry, I'm not sure why that's repeating, but okay. Saliency models largely struggled with this. So we have a lot more evaluation within the paper itself, but this is sort of one of the most indicative examples of where these models fail to perform well. So each dot represents an image in the O3 dataset, and on the vertical axis we have the maximum saliency ratio averaged across the top 3 performing classical models, and along the horizontal axis we have the maximum saliency ratio of the target versus distractors for the top 3 performing deep learning models. So this represents the best of any of the saliency models we tested, and we averaged them in order to try and make up for any individual deficiencies that they might have. And overall, we found that the vast majority of the images, as you can see, are clustered down towards the bottom left of the plot, which basically says that the target did not stand out against the distractors at all. Anything that is in the red zone of the plot says that the target was actually less salient than the distractor. Anything in the yellow zone says that it was marginally more salient, but not in a particularly meaningful way. And then once you get into the green area, that's where the target was picked up by either the deep learning or the classical models very distinctly. But the majority of images are clustered down in the area where the target was not picked up. Sorry, what I just described is written here. So yeah, the majority of images fall below the difference. So saliency models are doing a poor job of predicting saliency. Why not repurpose them as a fixation predictor? But there are, again, some open problems in fixation prediction, which are not currently addressed by saliency models. So, for example, they might tell us where. So here we have a pretty nice saliency map for this given input. This is a painting by Ilya Repin, which is famous in the eye fixation or eye movement research world because it was one of the first images that had eye movements tracked for it. And so if we look at this saliency map output, it definitely highlights the faces, and that's actually where people will tend to look if they're just free viewing this image. But it doesn't tell us when they're going to look at them. So it doesn't tell us what order eye movements are likely to traverse the image in. And so you might say, well, are they going to be looking at, for example, the man coming through the door, or maybe the little kids over on the right? Which one are they going to notice first? And so You can attempt to extract that by just taking maximum values and then suppressing that region and continuously sampling maximal pixel values in the saliency map. And if you do that, you come up with something like this shown in red, where the saliency map, the saliency model is just predicting you're bouncing back and forth across the image. But that's not how humans look. Humans will tend to make these short jumps and traverse in a much more sort of a much more controlled path through the image. Another thing that currently is not represented at all is the scale at which the image is shown. So here it's the same image, it's just one is shrunk down to half size. And if I showed you the small image that covers a smaller area arc of your field of view, you would have different fixations than on the large image. But for these, for pretty much all deep learning models, they're going to resize the image, project it onto, and then in order to fit their network size, and then give the same output regardless of which input you sent. And so what instead we tried to do is we tried to come up with an attention module, attention architecture that uses saliency as an internal module within it, but also starts to build up some of this other semantic detail about how we control our eye movements. And so this was in this CVPR paper, Active Fixation Control to Predict saccade sequences. And so what we do is we take the input image and we first blur it to indicate where you are looking, and that applies the degree of retinal anisotropy that exists within your eye. So what you're looking at currently, what you're fixating on, has high acuity, and then acuity will gradually reduce as you move towards the periphery of your gaze. And then we run a different saliency model for the central region of your gaze and for the periphery. Then we recombine them and into a conspicuity map, apply an inhibition of return mechanism, and then predict a new fixation based off of the combined priority map that takes all of these factors in. And qualitatively, we can show that this much more closely maps onto the way humans look than when we extract from a static saliency map. So shown up on the upper right is the output of our fixation predictor model. And as you can see, it has these similar clusters to the way that people are tracing their eyes over the image, and then people jump. And the reason why I'm showing this off of compared to human data from 1967 is because it's one of the only long sequences of eye tracking data. So when Yarbus was first performing this, he would track people's eyes for several minutes at a time to get these very long sequences. Modern eye tracking data sets tend to just take very short sequences of about 15 seconds or so. And so in terms of qualitative behavior, we wanted to compare against these longer sequences. And so just to show that it's not just that image, I've got another example here, which is showing it's a different painting that Yarbus experimented with. And again, we can see that the structure of the output for our model, shown in the upper right, is much more closely aligned with the way that a human observer moved their eyes over 2 minutes of looking at this image than when we extract fixation predictions from a static saliency map, shown in the different models below on the bottom row. We can also make predictions about spatial behavior. So in this case, I haven't shown a comparison against other saliency models, and we don't actually know what the eccentricity was that this painting was displayed to an observer at for Yarbus's experiment, because he didn't record that in his book. But this would be a future work that potentially someone could do, which would be to take recordings for human observers over a bunch of different sizes of the image, and then see how those different patterns are exhibited and see which ones our model maps onto better. And because we can explicitly control how we blur the image based off of our modeled retina, we can actually make these predictions at different degrees of eccentricity of the display of the image. So here on the bottom left, I show the output of our model when it is expecting the image occupies 40 degrees of your field of view. And as you can see, that's much closer to the actual output that Yarbus produced than when we increase that to 90 degrees. And there the pattern of exploration is much more restricted within the image and tends to have stronger clusters. I expect that that's probably not as accurate. We didn't have nearly as much data, large eccentricities to test against. So I expect that's somewhere that our model could likely be improved. And then just to show that we also have quantitative performance, I always have to show your bold numbers. So we have here, we did trajectory evaluation using the Euclidean distance, Fréchet distance, and Hausdorff distance against human sequences for the CAT 2000 dataset. The reason why we picked that dataset is that its display size was relatively large for a fixation dataset. It was occupied about 45 degrees of visual field. And so in that case, the way that we do the retinal blurring is more likely to matter. And so, as you can see, we have essentially on par with human inter-subject differences in terms of our prediction of where the eye is going over the first 5 fixations. So just to conclude, so we can get to questions. Deep learning is great for achieving high fidelity pattern matching, but sometimes pattern matching itself is not necessarily the end goal. So in saliency modeling, there's a deficit in it that's not reflected in current fixation benchmarks, which can be revealed when testing stimuli that are explicitly chosen for saliency. Likewise, when it comes to fixation modeling, you can achieve richer results by incorporating saliency models into a larger semantically interpretable control model. And the reason why we focused on this semantically interpretable structure is because saliency in and of itself, in terms of explaining human vision, doesn't do a great job. But by having a semantic control network, we can start to now experiment with connecting it to other models of human cognition and seeing if we can create a richer model of human vision and start to make broader psychological predictions of how humans are likely to behave. And so, yeah, that's what I had just said. All right, I'll open it up to questions now.
Okay, thank you, Calden. It's always amazing to decipher how human vision works, to see research on that aspects. So I have a number of questions for you. So would you a little bit elaborate on fixation modeling and object detection in generally? So there's always a question that if we have object detections to detect all different sorts of objects, why would we need any predictive model of fixations?
Yeah, so it really depends on what you're trying to do with your model. So if you were trying to, one of the reasons why saliency matters is for particularly cluttered scenes. You have a lot of objects. So in that case, if you're trying to predict what it is that a person's going to notice, maybe they're not going to have a chance to exhaustively look at the image for a long period of time, then you do want some sort of salient ranking of those objects to see what the person's likely to pick up and notice. The other thing too is if you are dealing with, for example, very large resolution images or just limited bandwidth, then having a saliency model running first can try to constrain the processing that you need to do to just the objects that matter, instead of trying to then identify a bunch of extra objects that you don't necessarily care about.
Yeah, great. So do you know of any scenarios? So besides the time and bandwidth limitations or any sort of limitations that is imposed by the scenario, the application. So do you know of any cases that even in a loose scenario, an object detector could simply fail? So any,
Yeah. So I mean, there's often cases where, for example, you could have a, object that's hard to see. Maybe it has it's like camouflage, like somewhat camouflaged with its background. In that case, the saliency model is likely not going to pick it up explicitly, but it might be able to pick up some of the discontinuities that the object introduces, such that you look at it more carefully and then you say, oh, there is an object there. So the way that it's used, that humans tend to use it, is essentially if something grabs you out of the corner of your eye or something like that, says, oh, I need to look at that a little bit more carefully. And then, but again, another way that it could be used is for something like a mobile robot, where if you do sort of a quick pan of a scene, in that case, it's not necessarily the processing limitations of the robot, but it might be the robot's time. Maybe it has to quickly go in and find something as fast as possible. And so it can use a saliency model to maybe grab a wide angle view of the room or whatever that it's trying to investigate. And then anything that shows up, maybe it can't completely figure out what is there, but it can highlight locations that have more interesting things going on there, and then it can move to that location and take a closer shot with its camera.
so you basically mean that in an active learning scenario, it's always not enough to have an object detector or an object detection system that could address the requirements of this kind of the application. It's always some prioritization, some focus of attention, some sort of tuning that could kind of help us to kind of reach to the solution.
Yeah, so having active control over your acquisition of new visual information gives you a really good way of improving the quality of that information versus just a passive sensor.
And we also have some evidence in terms of the confusion of object detectors based on deep learning, that it seems that the evidence are strong. Evidence is strong in terms of the visual representation. So we have still not 100% or reliable representations using neural nets, using which we can have a high confidence of prediction of even objects. So it seems that even there we have a lot space to kind of explore and exploit human-driven kind of observations.
Yeah.
So
I think understanding how humans do it is still a useful way of approaching AI.
So one question I have with respect to the model that you presented, just is it a star?
Oh yeah. Sorry, I didn't actually explain the acronym. It's the Selective Tuning Attentive Reference Model for Fixation Control. So we were just doing the fixation control part, but the idea is to try and connect it to those broader attentive reference models that I was talking about.
So if we can get back to the slides that you present. So I have a question about how do you evaluate the quality of your model? And then also what is your, and they ask if there is any loss. So the question is, how do you kind of supervise your, is there any learning? How do you tune?
So currently what we've done is we just tested existing saliency models as a subcomponent of the item. So we took a model that had been trained just in a standard saliency training. Basically, usually it was, so in this case, this slide's actually slightly out of date. We've also tested Deep Gaze 2 and I think one other one, but I'm forgetting now. But we tested Salicon and Deep Gaze 2 in that central field area. And So those were trained in a classic way. Usually they would take an object detection network such as VGG, and then do fine tuning on it to fixation data. Whether that was actual human fixation data or a proxy data set such as the Salicon data set, which was actually derived from mouse clicks over blurred images. And so we take those networks that have been trained to do fixation prediction, and then we plug them into our model. We would like to, because of those deficits that I presented from the BMVC paper, where that's not actually completely representing saliency, we would like to develop a custom model for this network that is both designed explicitly to handle a anisotropic field of view, as well as is geared towards saliency modeling explicitly. And then we can start to pull out some of these other higher level representations that these models have kind of combined with saliency. But currently that work is ongoing. Last year, we did a little bit of work trying to take a deep network that had been trained on object detection and extract from it features for a new saliency representation. But we found that it didn't converge. So we're still trying to figure out how to make that.
So do you have any fine tuning in this afterwards? You have the models, or you just use them as it is and you have the modules?
Yeah. So we have a number of parameters that go into this model, but in this case we weren't fine tuning them per se. What we did is we set up the parameters to have semantic interpretation, such as the field of view occupied by the input image. And then there were a couple parameters that didn't have a very strong semantic interpretation, such as a gain factor between the peripheral field and the central field. And so in that case, we did just test a few different values of it and take the best one. But yeah, for the most part, we tried to make everything have as clear of an interpretation as possible. And then so we would set it beforehand based off of the characteristics of the fixation data that we were comparing against, rather than trying to tune the model to give us the best result. We wanted it actually to be, we could set it as a predictive, to make it give us a prediction saying, okay, if you viewed it at this eccentricity over this duration of time, what would your output be?
And so probably a little bit fundamental question is that how much the sequence of fixation matters? So is it not just the locations that we pay attention to, or does the sequence really matters?
So it again depends on what your application is. If you're dealing with something like video, it definitely matters because the frame is only visible for enough time usually to have a single fixation. Sometimes it's not even enough time because you're really only moving your eye every certain number of frames, because you make an eye movement roughly on average about 5 times a second. So if you have 24 frames, you're again not even having a chance to move your eye with every frame. So in that case, it would matter because only the first fixation could possibly be fixated actively by an observer. But also for things like advertising or even scientific figures that are given to politicians, for example, a lot of the time there's been studies that suggest that people will only look for maybe 5 seconds or something like that. And so in that case, the order does matter because if you have a static map, it's kind of not really clear how much time that static map is modeling. Because all it's doing is it's pattern matching to a fixation data set. And those data sets vary in how long they present images to viewers. And so you're going to be learning your prediction based off of that, whatever the duration was that the researchers used to gather that fixation data set. So if it was 15 seconds, you're going to be predicting a saliency map for 15 seconds of viewing. But if you're actually predicting for something like an advertisement, or maybe it's only an average of 5 seconds of viewing, then your prediction is going to be off. So, or if you're predicting, for example, for things that have understanding components, like a scientific figure, there's often things that you want someone to notice first before they look at somewhere else, because their understanding will be dependent on them already having gathered certain amounts of information from that figure. So in that case, order will also matter.
Yeah.
So yeah, generally location is the most important for evaluating the saliency of an image, but there are definitely cases where order will contribute to our understanding of how a person is going to interact with it.
Thank you. And you mentioned some interesting idea. I don't know if it's been touched very deeply by people, but do we have any hierarchical fixation? So as you move in, kind of zoom in into the image, we have a record of how the eye fixations change.
Oh yeah, so there's really I haven't seen a study that has explicitly compared them.
Mhm.
All I know is that there have been a few studies with small numbers that have looked at modifying the image with things like blurring, changing the size, flipping, that kind of thing. And it shows that those fixations are different, but not in the level of or the amount of data that would be needed to really perform a benchmark experiment. But I definitely think that would be an interesting thing to do, especially now that we're developing a model that can actually make predictions over that. But I definitely think that there's holes in our model for the way that we do that prediction, because I think there's aspects of how people explore, for example, a very large image. A lot of the time, they're going to be basing their jumps of fixation or their saccades off of other factors like a need to explore the image, rather than just the visual salience of where they're moving the eye.
Yeah, yeah, I feel that there's gonna be a lot of work needed in that area, since we are going towards for instance in video games, the resolution is going higher and higher, and the fact that to be able to kind of encode them or that sort of thing is very I think it's very needed, and that sort of research is gonna shed light on the aspects, different aspects of our vision. So I think this is gonna be the last question. So you mentioned two data sets. Are they available if people wanna use them or kind of download them?
Let me go back to sorry, I wasn't sure in Google Meeting how to show a
Oh,
pointer. Oh, here it is. Never mind.
okay.
So yeah, it's just up
Oh,
here.
so the link, people wanna get the data set and
Yeah, so you can go to the link. It'll have more information about the data sets themselves, as well as you can download the images as well as our annotations. So we went through every image and annotated all of the. So for example, if you look
so
at
is it in terms of the
uh,
mask, binary mask? You have, oh, okay.
yeah, so we would create a binary mask that would, for example, segment like for this bird one, it would segment the white bird, and then every black bird would also have a segmentation mask. So you would have a distractor mask that covers all of the distractors, and you have a mask that covers the target, and then anything that's not covered by either of those is considered background.
Oh,
Likewise, for example, for these cats, you would have a mask around the dark furred cat, the tabby, and then the orange tabbies would all have one mask that would cover them.
cool. Yeah. Okay, that's amazing. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for uh, your time, Calden, and
Thank you for inviting me.
hope you uh, kind of can explore this journey and kind of take it to more interesting stages in the future.
Thank you.
Okay, so I would also like to thank the audience for joining us and hope to see you all in our next computer vision spotlight session. Thank you. Have a good day.